Bari Weiss. Bari, welcome. Shabbat Shalom. We're so honored by your presence. Shabbat Shalom to you.
Shabbat Shalom. Thanks, Rabbi Cosgrove, and thanks for that lovely introduction, Olivia.
You know, Bari, I look at you, and I know the last time I think I saw you maybe was in the community. You've been a guest with us. We applaud you, as Olivia mentioned, for your critical thinking, for your intellectual leadership, your personal warmth. You always have a home here at Park Avenue Synagogue. But I can't help but think how much the world has changed. And since that day, I think it was in the Tree of Life shooting in October of 2018 that you wrote with such passion to our nation. And today, of course, we're all watching the impeachment hearings. And so a tough question to begin with, but it connects the story here. Do you see a line, Bari, between the events of that day in Pittsburgh and the storming of the Capitol and where we are right now? Is it all connected?
It's all connected insofar as, well, let me step back a minute. When I wrote my book, in the aftermath of the massacre at Tree of Life, which, as everyone here knows, was the most lethal attack on Jews in American history, and happened right in my hometown, the place where I became a bat mitzvah, I would say that anti-Semitism at that moment in America was sort of like the horse and buggy speed of anti-Semitism. Now anti-Semitism in America is the velocity of something more like a high-speed rail between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. My inbox is a really, really good microcosm of this. As you guys can all imagine, I'm at the receiving end of a lot of stories, and I always have been, because I've always been very out publicly as a Jew since the time I was an activist as a college student. And 2 years ago I got a story once every 2 weeks that deserved to be told. Now I get sometimes multiple stories in a day. And these stories range. I write in my book about the three-headed dragon of anti-Semitism that comes from the far left, anti-Semitism that comes from the far right, which is what you referred to in your question, which I'll get to, and anti-Semitism that comes from radical Islam. The last one is really a more European phenomenon, but the first two are the ones that we're encountering here. And the thing that has become so tragic and maybe even befuddling about the reality that we're living in is when someone accuses the Jews of starting a race war. Does that come from acolytes of Louis Farrakhan, or does that come from acolytes of David Duke? When people talk about Jewish privilege on Twitter, is that coming from the far left that sees Jews as sort of fake victims? Or is that coming from a far right that wants to accuse Jews of being sort of the greatest trick the devil has ever played? You can see what I'm getting at, which is to say that the sort of horseshoe theory of politics is very much at play when it comes to anti-Semitism. The thing that seems to unite people these days, unfortunately, is conspiracy theories, and oftentimes conspiracy theories around the Jews, because of course anti-Semitism is the oldest conspiracy theory. When Pittsburgh happened, I think I wrote this, but I know also my colleague at the New York Times and previously at the Wall Street Journal, Brett Stevens, analogized the shooter to a jihadi. In other words, the jihadi doesn't come out of nowhere. They're marinating in a certain stew, a certain set of ideas, a certain culture that empowers them to think that what they are doing by going out and killing innocent people is somehow just. I think the same is true with the Pittsburgh killer, with the neo-Nazi 6 months later to the day who killed people in Poway out here in California, the attacks that are taking place almost daily on the streets of places like Crown Heights and Borough Park against the most visible Jews. Some of that, of course, had to do with our previous president who dismantled the moral guardrails that keep bigotry down. But he's not the only one that's to blame. I think that the things that have kept the Jews in America safe not just the Jews, but other minorities, the things that have made America the most exceptional, and still to this day, despite everything, the most exceptional diaspora experience in Jewish history, is a loyalty and a defense of a certain set of ideas. Ideas that at their very best, the founders exemplified. The idea that everyone is created the image of God, and that therefore everyone is entitled to equality under the law. The idea that we're not tribal, but we judge people according to their individual merit. The idea that we are not a land of blood and soil ethnicity, where people are not born into some kind of original sin or original privilege because of their skin color or because of the circumstances of their birth. Those are ideas that are not just under siege from the far right, they're very much under siege on the far left, and they have unfortunately made their way into a lot of the institutions that I think a lot of us took for granted as upholding the liberal order.
Well, they don't call you Bari Weiss for nothing. Thank you. My only complaint is that I have about 8 million follow-up questions for you, because you've outlined this horseshoe theory of anti-Semitism, that whether it comes from the left or it comes from the right, it's all bad. And so is there, I mean, I sort of want to ask you what worries you most, but I think part of my question underneath that is, beyond saying you have this ideology that the extremes marinate in, is there sort of a fundamental difference in DNA of it coming from one side or the other, or is that just a useless question because it's all bad, so who cares where it comes from?
There's a young Zionist Jewish activist who goes to GW. His name is Blake Flayton. I met him because he read my book, wrote me an email. He subsequently wrote an incredible op-ed for the New York Times called On the Front Lines of Progressive Anti-Semitism. And he had a great tweet this week about exactly this question, where he said, anti-Semitism from the right punches you right in the face. It's the anti-Semitism that says all Jews must die, which is what Robert Bowers, the Pittsburgh killer, said. It's the anti-Semitism that announces itself. We don't need to have a Talmudic debate about all Jews must die. We see it for what it is. So that's the punch in the face kind of anti-Semitism. The anti-Semitism that comes from the far left is, he analogized it to a frog in boiling water. It's the kind of thing that you're like, is it getting a little hotter in here? You kind of question yourself. You wonder if you're the only one experiencing the discomfort. You don't want to be on the wrong side of history. You don't want to say anything that would make you anything other than a good liberal or progressive. And so you sit there. You sit there as the water gets hotter and hotter and hotter. And the reason that I often get criticized for this, the reason that I think it's so important to focus on that kind of anti-Semitism is because it is much more insidious. I don't mean much more lethal. When I speak in synagogues, the reason that there's often armed guards, but certainly lots of security, is not typically because of a member of the Democratic Socialists of America or a tenured professor at an Ivy League university. They're generally not the people that I'm scared are going to walk into a synagogue with a gun. However, the guy that's going to walk into the synagogue with a gun does not control the levers of American sense-making, culture, ideas, education, increasingly our corporations, big tech. And that is the kind of anti-Semitism that I think, and I imagine those who are here with us tonight on Shabbat and those who go to Park Avenue Synagogue are encountering in their daily life. I say that only because that's the milieu that I live in, right? I live in a neighborhood right now in LA where there's like more NPR tote bags than there are Bibles. Everyone has a little sign in their front lawn about, no bigotry in our house, social justice, bona fides. That's my world. And I imagine that's the world of a lot of people on this call. Most people on this call are now not encountering neo-Nazis in their daly life. They don't know anyone that has that Camp Auschwitz sweatshirt. What they are encountering is an anti-Semitism that comes from the far left, that comes cloaked in the garments of moral righteousness, and therefore catches, I believe, a lot of Jews flat-footed, tongue-tied, and unsure about how to respond to it. That's why I feel a particular moral calling to speak out about it and speak out about it clearly. And it's very much connected to the reason that I left my job. So I'm trying to walk the walk in my own life.
Yeah. I want to ask you about that, but you're touching on, it's an honor to have you on any Shabbat. This is a special Shabbat for our community. And but we've also targeted our teens and their families specifically. And I recently read a piece you had in Substack, as well as other things you've written in conversations we've had. We're living it in many ways, the children, the teenagers in various New York schools. And sometimes when you're so close, you don't see the big picture. So whether it's on high school campuses, or whether it's you've written on what's happening with ethnic studies, minority curriculum in California, what are you seeing as it affects teens and college students?
So the 10,000-foot version, for those who are new to my writing or who I am or have no idea who I am and you're just at shul tonight, I think one of the big untold stories in American life, and it's untold because it affects, because the people who would tell it are implicated in it, is the ideological seizure of places like the New York Times, Harvard, Dalton, Fieldston, Brentwood, Harvard Westlake, lots of technology companies, increasingly the HR departments of major corporations. The tenets of this ideology, they claim that it is progressive. It is not progressive. It is not liberal. It is an ideology that is zealous and basically insists that in the name of historical justice, we need to erect a new kind of caste system. So if the old caste system, really in the West, until 5 minutes ago, had people like, Brad Pitt and John Hamm at the very top and a person of color who's trans and disabled at the very bottom, they come around. I'm speaking like super shorthand here because I know we have a lot of questions to get to. They come around and say, we got to remedy that. And the way we're going to remedy that is not by saying, let's fight for a world with no caste system. Let's fight for a world in which people are judged by the content of their character and not by the color of their skin, a world in which everyone has opportunities to fulfill the American dream. No, they're saying, let's reverse that caste system. And so it's actually an ideology that says that the more claim to victimhood you have, the more right you have to speak, the more claim you have to truth, the more claim you even have to morality. That is a very, very dangerous, illiberal, un-American idea. And I don't care if it calls itself social justice or whatever language it uses to describe itself. Any ideology that suggests that some people are born more righteous than others, that some people are born more righteous than others because of the color of their skin. There is no word for that other than wrong, illiberal, and racist. And I think that a lot of our kids right now and a lot of their heart-aching parents are caught inside institutions that are trying to sell this ideology to them as if it is the new brand of liberalism. It's not. It is not that. And I think it is just extremely important that people speak out against it and speak out against things that they know in their gut and in their soul are wrong. The problem is that too many people that I speak to, and I'm working on a big story right now where I'm interviewing a lot of parents and kids, and it's so much worse than I could have imagined. But not a single person will allow me to use their name. And the reason they won't allow me to use their name, and I understand it, well, there's two reasons. One, they don't want to hurt their children. They don't want to restrict their kids' opportunity to be well liked by the college counselor and get into the school of their choice. And much more significantly than that, they are scared of being smeared. They are scared of being called racist or bigoted or being on the wrong side of history. And I have to tell you, I'm not revealing anything that you guys don't already know to say that I understand that because I've lived it. I understand it because I've lived it. And I guess I would just appeal to all of you and suggest to you that that choice is basically sacrificing not just our collective long-term health as a liberal democracy, but your own. Meaning, if we don't speak out about this now, it is not going to get any easier. And the very things that we are fighting to protect won't even be there to protect if we stay silent about this for longer. So there's much more to say on that subject, but I'll say one last thing, which is sort of like the Jewish role in all of this. The far right says to the Jews, you look white, at least here in America, the majority of, unlike in Israel, where the majority of Jews are of North African or Middle Eastern descent, Mizrahi and Sephardi, here most Jews are of Ashkenazi descent. So we have skin like mine. We appear to be white. And the far right says, you seem like you're white, but in fact, you're tricksters, because what you really are loyal to Black people and brown people and Muslims and immigrants, which is, of course, why the shooter in Pittsburgh chose Tree of Life, because the previous Shabbat, it had celebrated Refugee Shabbat along with the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. That's an old trope. That is one that we understand. For some reason, the history of left-wing anti-Semitism, specifically as it presented itself under the Soviet Union, is not as much taught, and I'm not exactly sure why. But that is the anti-Semitism that says to Jews, and because it's America, it's framed around the lens of race, it says, you say you're victims, you say that you have this history of oppression, but look at you. You're so successful. You benefit from white privilege. You are a tiny percentage of the population, and look at you, you punch way above your weight. Oh, and by the way, you guys all happen to be loyal to what we view, I'm speaking the language of the illiberal left, you're loyal to Israel, which they view as the last standing bastion of white colonialism in the Middle East. So we're guilty of the two most grievous sins on the far left in Western life today, racism and colonialism at once. And that puts it began on college campuses, and it was bad when I was there 15 years ago. And now it's trickled all the way down, not just to high schools, to elementary schools, where Jews and our history is erased and we are flattened into white people. I had a mother call me the other day. Her 9-year-old child came home from school crying. Jews in New York City saying, "Mommy, are we so bad?" And she said, "What are you talking about?" And the child said, "Well, we're bad because all white people are bad." These are the kind of stories I'm hearing constantly, and it is extremely dangerous for all Americans, and it is extremely dangerous for Jews, because we know very well from our entire history, but of course most recently our history in Europe, that any ideology, whether it comes from the right or the left, that is totalizing, that says you're either the oppressor or the oppressed, you're the pure or the impure, you're the victim or the victimizer, is extremely, extremely dangerous for us.
But it's confusing. It's confusing for adults. It's all the more so confusing for kids when, power structures are working the way they do. I mean, the rabbi gets up, as I did tonight, and talked about being a stranger in a strange land. These are our progressive values. We identify with the victim. We identify with the oppressed. And then, and then we're told X, Y, and Z in our schools or on our campuses. And then you see what happened on January 6th as people are storming the Capitol. And there's, even as there are chants and people wearing Camp Auschwitz shirts, there are also people wearing, like with an Israeli flag. I mean, it is confusing, Bari. And so even leaving aside the school administrator off the rails, right, it's hard to make sense of.
It is, but it becomes easier to make sense of if you stick to the eternal values that are embedded in Judaism. the values that the founders of this country, for all of their flaws, were inspired by, right? Like Lincoln called Americans the almost chosen people because he knew who the chosen people were. Benjamin Franklin wanted the image on the Great Seal of this country to be Moses crossing the Red Sea. Like, there's a reason that Jews have thrived here. It's because Hebrew and Jewish ideas are synonymous with American ones at their very best. So again, it becomes much easier to understand, I guess, the contradictions or the confusion when you stick to some home truths that we know are correct. Judging people according to who they are and not by the sins of their parents, rejecting the idea of collective guilt, rejecting the idea that mob justice is justice. It is never just. Never joining a mob, never turning against your own kin, being willing to sit at the same Shabbat table as people with different politics than you, giving people a second chance, giving people grace, mercy. Maybe those are Christian ideas too. I mean,
Still
like,
good values.
I mention all of that only because, I mean, it's sad to me that I have to mention those things, but like, those are the foundational values that seem to have fallen away in too many places, including in places that brand themselves as being liberal.
But Barry, surely there are, I mean, the name of the book, I think, is How to Be an Anti-Racist, right? This is one of the sort of chants of critical race theory. It's not enough simply not to be a racist. You know, a good person has to be an anti-racist. And what I understand, and you're far more well-read than I am on this, is that there are unspoken structures in society of privilege for one community over another by the color of people's skins, socioeconomics, and otherwise, that need to be named, that need to be called out. And it's not simply enough to be a good guy and treat everyone kindly. I mean, is that so? But and yet, I hear you that you're saying there's a toxic undertone to that, but I'm just trying to understand how one can be an ally in creating a just society, but at the same time not to get swallowed up into the underbelly of critical race theory.
There's good anti-racism and there's bad anti-racism. Good anti-racism is humanistic, is liberal, and does not reify the insidious, unscientific, backward idea of race. An anti-racism that strengthens a social construct, which is race, and makes us obsess on it, makes our children obsess on it, is not a good version of anti-racism. It's illiberal. I would say there's illiberal anti-racism, totalitarian anti-racism, and then there's humanistic, pro-human anti-racism. So right now, unfortunately, the dominant voices in the culture, the number one debut this week on the New York Times bestseller list is Ibram Kendi's new book, but Robin DiAngelo also fits into this bucket. Those are bad anti-racists. Those are, and everyone should read those books because they speak for themselves. I don't need to make the case. You can read them and understand why I'm saying that. Again, it goes back to the totalizing ideology that I was talking about before. So, sorry, to go back to what I was saying. It's unfortunate to me that those are the voices that are the most amplified when there are voices like Coleman Hughes, John McWhorter, Glenn Lowry, Chloe Valdari, John Wood, Camille Foster, Wilfred Riley. These are the kind of Black intellectuals, Black writers, Black culture makers that if we lived in a more healthy, less polarized society would be 10 times more famous than Ibram Kendi. One of the things that I think is that I try and do in my own life is elevate those kind of voices. Thomas Chatterton Williams is another. I'm happy to send around a reading list to everyone after this with podcasts and articles and books. I have one already set up. So that's the first thing I would say. Second thing I would say is that it's very important to look under the hood of popular slogans. Okay? The Women's March being a really, really great example. Women's March, I'm a feminist. I'm marrying a woman. I'm exactly the kind of person that should be putting on the pink hat and rah-rah with the Women's March. But I also have to be honest, and I have to see, oh my God, the people running this march are people that are very close to Louis Farrakhan, refuse to disavow him. And what does it say about me and my willingness to sacrifice my identity and my dignity as a Jew and a Zionist to participate in that? I'd rather think about what are the causes, what are the feminist causes that I want to support that don't require me to cut off a part of myself in order to belong. And I would say the same thing about Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter is a genius slogan because it is inarguable. Of course, Black Lives Matter. We believe that as Jews because we believe that everyone's created in the image of God. So every single person's life matters, and the extent to which Black lives have been historically undervalued, whether it's because of, and we need this, criminal injustice, because of the drug wars, because of school choice, because of all kinds of things, we need to be fighting for those causes. But I have to be honest, and I look under the hood of the organization Black Lives Matter, go onto their website, do a little Googling, and it's a front, unfortunately, for critical race theory and for all kinds of ideas that I don't think are just bad for Black lives, but that are bad for all Americans. Abolishing the nuclear family, defunding or abolishing the police. A few years ago was Israel's carrying out genocide. I cannot be associated with those ideas. And so I think it's incumbent on every thinking person to say to yourself, okay, what does draw me in about this movement, whether it's the women's movement or the racial justice movement? And how can I, in my own life, support those causes that I care about without getting caught up in a movement that doesn't speak to me? So for me, that means supporting organizations like the Innocent Project, which I give tzedakah to every year. It means supporting school choice. It means elevating the kind of voices that I mentioned to you before. There's lots of ways to get involved in these movements and to ask yourself what draws you to them without giving up something of yourself. I think a lot of what's happening right now is that people feel pressured, tremendous social pressure to post the right hashtag or post the right black square on Instagram, whatever it is, okay? It changes every single day in order to fit in. And I would simply say that that is the behavior of people that live in a closed society, not people that live in a liberal democracy. And I'm not suggesting to you, I can't lie to you, I'm not suggesting to you that speaking out, or really not just speaking out, refusing to go along with it doesn't come with some cost, because it does. But I'm here to tell you that I think that cost is not just worth it, will not just lead you to a more meaningful, true, authentic life, but that you will find that what's actually happening is that it's the majority of people who are going along with these movements because they feel the pressure. And the more people that sort of take the leap and, you know, to use the Harvey Milk line, come out, it's going to, you're going to see that that you're going to look around to your neighbor and be like, oh yeah, you too.
But let me, I don't know if this is a challenge, but look, of the questions that we got, and I got more questions for you as a speaker than any speaker thus far this year. I don't know what that's a metric of, but a lot of the biggest question is to tell the story of you in the New York Times.
Sure.
And I want to ask you that question based on your last answer, because and I hope there's nothing impolite in what I'm about to ask you. That I always thought that if you want to affect change from within. And so whether or not it's a feminist march or the Republican Party or the Democratic Party or anything, right, you can stand on the sidelines, and that it's actually really important. Organizations like Zionists and otherwise who are saying, gosh darn it, I'm a feminist, I'm a Zionist, these are my causes. It gives me huge pride when there's someone trying to effectuate change from within an organization. And so at a certain point, you know, I'll let you tell the story. You felt that couldn't or wouldn't be the case at the Times. And so it leads me to, you know, here and now. So I was wondering if you could
Sure.
reflect on that.
I mean, obviously, I spent my entire life inside institutions, the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times being the most prominent of them. And, I wouldn't say that I have a natural, like, rebel personality. I don't know, maybe I do. But the point being that I came to the New York Times on that premise. I came to the New York Times following the election of following the surprise election of Trump, and I was going to call him the Donald. And I would say I was a diversity hire in the sense of, along with Bret Stephens, in the sense of the Times is overwhelmingly left. Let's bring in these writers. And in my case, I was more an editor than a writer, who can expose our readers to other perspectives, because, wow, we really don't understand half the country. And it's our job to reflect back the country and the world as it is. So I came to the New York Times pretty much as bright-eyed and bushy-tailed as you can imagine, wanting to do just that. It's no secret for people to know that I was never cool there. I was never invited to sit at the popular table. There were certain colleagues who didn't speak to me from day one because they knew that I was a Zionist. And I was okay with that. I've been in a lot of really uncomfortable environments. It was worth it to me, that kind of, freeze out, socially at least, in part, because it's the New York Times. Like, love it or hate it, it's still, at least of this moment, hopefully it won't be in a few years from now, the most powerful news organization in the world. And the opportunity to not just publish my own ideas and my own perspectives on that platform, but to bring in people that would not otherwise appear in the Times, people like Ayaan Hirsi Ali, dissidents throughout the Arab world and China, Mati Friedman, Yossi Klein Halevi, Glenn Lowry. I mean, there's so many people that it was like the honor of my life to work with those people. Unfortunately, and maybe some of you are experiencing this in the various institutions that you're a part of, I gave it my absolute all to try and change it from within. And without revealing any confidences, I could probably publish a book with the amount of memos and emails to the powers that be at the New York Times that I wrote about any number of issues. I gave it more than the old college try. But as I wrote in a recent column, try as hard as you can to change the institutions that you're a part of, but it's like a relationship. If you see that the relationship is dead, it's not a good idea to stick around past that point. Better that you go and build a new relationship, or in this case, build new institutions that embody the kind of values that make this country good, liberal. Ultimately, I left the New York Times in the aftermath of the Tom Cotton debacle, as all of you know. But every single day since then has brought another story that has only validated my concerns and the reasons that I've left. The New York Times is not the New York Times. The reason that I find it's very important to say that, and it's not just about the Times, it's about lots of institutions. They have the same crest, they have the same logo. In the case of the New York Times, they have the same typeface, but there is a chasm between the branding of the New York Times and the actual thing that it is. And the pain right now, I think, that a lot of people are experiencing is the gap between those two things. It's the paper of record. Again, apply this to whatever institution. It's this amazing place. It's this amazing school. It's this amazing company. It's this amazing newspaper. We've always thought it was X, but it turns out it's no longer X. And it's funny to me because in the case of the Trump administration and the White House, everyone was able to see that. Everyone was able to see, oh my God, an institution is really just the people. Institutions are just people. Like there's not like a secret Wizard of Oz thing in any of these cases. It's just the people and the values that they bring to it. And to the extent that they uphold the historic values that have made the thing, excellent. But we see how quickly that can collapse. That is what's going on right now at the paper. I didn't want to be part of an organization that didn't tell the truth, that didn't live up to the idea of no fear or favor, of no party or clique, telling the truth, even when it's inconvenient. I went into journalism to do those things. I came to the Times because I believed that they were doing those things. And once I felt that I had enough of a body of evidence to see that that wasn't going to be the case, I was willing to give up the prestige of it. And, you know, make no mistake, it's really exciting to tell people in New York City that you work for the New York Times, you know, certain Jewish communities accepted. I was willing to give all that up because I had to ask myself, like, what's the reason you're a journalist to begin with? And are you able to fulfill that mission here? And so I left really in order to pick up that flag again and plant it in the ground somewhere else.
I have to tell you, just in all candor, I'm struggling with what you're saying. And I'm struggling with, you know, Harvey Milk ran for office, right? At a certain point, right? And I'm thinking, if I care, right, whatever party I'm in, and I'm just thinking out loud with you, right? But the implications of it have to do with choices young people will make. Meaning, if I want to make sure that the Democratic Party is guided by sort of a centrist, sane ethic and not sort of the more toxic left-wing ethic, then that's only going to happen if I am sitting at the table with my presence. If I don't have it, but if I had the money to do it, if whatever it might be, and if I was politically oriented to run for office and assume the levers of power, right? I mean, that is a. And yet I'm also, you know, and I'm watching the news of today, and some people sticking with the Republican Party, some people leaving the Republican Party. It's just, I guess, Bari, it's just a fascinating question of, you know, by staying silent, by hopefully no one's staying silent, but are you an enabler of a system, as in the case of, right, what you're reflecting on in the New York Times? At a certain point, you just got to step out? Or is your very presence necessary to keep the train on the tracks? I don't have an answer. I'm struggling.
It's not a science question. It's a question of accelerationist versus not. It's a question that there's a famous sociologist who wrote this book called Exit Voice Loyalty, which is about exactly this question. Loyalty to a company, a brand, an institution, a party, voice, using your voice on the inside to be a kind of dissident, which I did, or exit. And by exit, strengthening the dissonant voices within and giving people an alternative. There are things in life, and especially the life of a Jew, that are way more important than having a seat at the table of a company like the New York Times, period. And I really want to make that clear to people. Like, there are things that are way more important than getting your child into Harvard or Yale. Way more important. And only you know the places that you're involved in. I'm just telling you that what I'm hearing from parents and children, what they are putting up with for the sake of that sort of fast track to a certain kind of life, I think is wrong. I think is ultimately damaging for them. And I think is damaging ultimately for the Jewish community. I really believe that.
Because by extension, you're suggesting that, right, this unspoken silencing of the Jewish community.
If people don't speak up for what's right, no one else is going to do it. That's it. I mean, it's a really simple message. I did an event with Ayan Hirsi Ali. A lot of people tried to cancel the event last night. Called us all kinds of horrible names. Someone resigned from the board of a Commonwealth club where we spoke in San Francisco. You can read about it all online. This is a person who's had to travel under armed guard for more than a decade and a half because she's willing to speak out against violence against women that often takes place in the name of radical Islam. And I said to her because she's one of my heroes, and I said to her, like, where does your courage come from? And she gave a bunch of answers, but the thing that stuck with me is she basically said, some people did this for me. I need to do this for other people. Like, no one else is going to stand up unless we do. And like, Purim's coming up. That's the message of the Purim story. That's the message of Esther. So
Esther stood up, but Esther stood up in the court of Achashverosh.
She outed herself. She outed herself, meaning She put herself in the court of Achashverosh. It's actually the perfect analogy. Mordechai comes to her and says, Esther, there's going to be basically a genocide of the Jews. And she famously says in chapter 4 of the Megillah, essentially, I don't want to out myself because I could be giving up everything. I'm the assimilated wife of the king. What would it mean if I outed myself? I'm scared. And he basically says to her, Esther, you can decide to keep quiet. But if you keep quiet, don't think that you will be spared. Do not think that you will be spared by your silence. Salvation for the Jewish people will come from another quarter. And ultimately, she does decide to risk everything. She risks not just her social capital, not just her standing, but her life. That's the story of Esther. That's the message of that book. Be willing to use every tool at your disposal. Be willing to risk all of your status and your capital for the sake of defending the Jewish people and doing the right thing.
So is the answer building up alternatives and organize it? Like if Bari Weiss had $1 million, right?
You need a lot more than that.
You need a lot more. Like, is it, what is the intervention? Is it to fight the mainstream media on the right or the left? Is it to seed new forms of media? Is it to create civic initiatives that teenagers of different stripes are talking to each other? Like, what's the dream if you had a lot more than $1 million?
Okay, so I'll tell you my dream and then I think writ large. And first of all, I want to give it a little bit of historical context. I know that this seems like hard, what I'm going to propose, but I would suggest to you that hard was rebuilding Judaism after the temple was destroyed by the Romans and the Babylonians, rebuilding a Jerusalem after animal sacrifice was outlawed and people had to figure out a Judaism without the temple. Hard is Natan Sharansky spending more than a decade in a gulag. That's hard. What do we have to do? We have to maybe build some new institutions. It's okay, we can do it. What do I think? I think that ours is the era of rebuilding new things. So that could mean a million different things. I talked to someone the other day that's building a new university. I talked to someone the other day who's building a new homeschooling network, someone who's trying to expand a school that exists out west and bring it to the east that's kind of like St. John's classical education, but for high schoolers. That's the mentality that we need. Not how do we preserve things that are very clearly rotted out or collapsed, or try and carve out a little bit of a corner for ourselves in our Jewish affinity group or whatever it is. No. Build new things. The Jews built unbelievable things in this country when they were kept out. They built hospital systems. They built Hollywood. Let's be honest. Let's think about what we can build. In my personal case, my expertise is the press. It's media. I want to build reality-based journalism for the sane, self-silencing majority. It's starting off in a humble way. It's starting off right now with my newsletter. But I'm in LA and I'm meeting with lots of super interesting people who frankly are closeted inside the mainstream right now and are doing the kind of dance that we talked about before, but who desperately want to see an alternative. So that's where I'm putting my focus. But if someone said to me, Bari, go and help start a new university, or go and help shore up one of the few, like the University of Chicago, that doesn't seem to have been lost yet, go do X, Y, I'm in. I spend all day, every day, either trying to help essentially counsel people that feel, as a mother said to me yesterday, crying like a prisoner in that world, trying to help them see that there is not just good stuff on the other side, the Wild West, as I call it, but lots of exciting things to be built. And then also spending my time building those things. We need things in the press specifically that aren't built on a business model of polarizing and tribalizing us. I really don't want to be part of projects that are basically, as a business model, base themselves around doing that. I want to build things that bring Americans together, that show that most of us aren't deep red or deep blue, but like purple. And I want to build things that allow me to be my full self.
So from the $1 billion, right, to the I got many questions, right, and you've touched on this, but what can parents do? Or to say it personally, what can Jewish educators do? And I saw your piece, a very important piece in the New York Post recently about, it was like the 10 ways to respond. And I hope you know that we as a synagogue and me personally are a partner in this, but we sort of, you're writing about the families of whom, many of whom attend my synagogue, right? So you get the phone call, whether it's from the kid or from the parent, and they're saying, what do I do? Do I speak to the administrator? Do I speak to the teacher? Do I pull my kid and go to another school? Do I, for me, it's about education and pride, but that doesn't help if you're, in this asymmetric war against your dean of students or whatever it might be, just to simply say, no, Zionism is not a colonial enterprise, right? So, yeah. So what counsel can you give our families, and maybe even what counsel can you give me as a Jewish educator?
Sure. So I'll leave the Jewish part for the second part of my answer, but I would say, practically speaking, the sense of isolation that I'm hearing from a lot of parents is really heartbreaking. I've heard people refer to underground Zooms, to secret WhatsApp groups. There's more of you than you know. And I think that the hour is very late inside a lot of these places. And coming out and asking for yourselves and for your children the things that you would demand for any other minority group is the baseline. It's the baseline. There's an epidemic, I think, of Jewish self-abnegation and Jewish shame. We're somehow not entitled to our kids having a great educational environment free from bias or really bile. And so that's the first thing. Remind yourself that you're entitled to the basic things that are entitled to every child and parent in the school. The second thing I would say is, don't remain in the closet. Collective action is a thing for a reason. It works. Get together with the other parents, even if it's a small handful, and work together. I know that in some of these schools, the administration refuses meetings with groups of parents because they want you to feel isolated and they'll only meet with individual parents. Refuse that. You guys are paying, some of you, $55,000 a year for these schools and donating more on top of it. That is leverage. Do not be afraid to use it. Do not be afraid to be uppity. And I think it's really, really important for you all to feel that deeply in yourself. That's the kind of practical thing. And then I would say, and again, it goes back to what I wrote in that piece in my own experience at the Times. Fight as hard as you possibly can. You have a right to. You have a right, just as much a right to be there as anyone. But if you feel ultimately like the school is giving your child a message that is making them have self-hatred, self-loathing, shame, is making them see the world, frankly, through the lens of race, and is making them fixate on that above other things, listen, there are other places to send your child. I can name a few in New York City. And I would say that, Jewish school, I don't know who has their kids in Jewish school or not. It's other than my parents, the biggest factor in making me who I am. And obviously some Jewish schools, some Catholic schools have been susceptible to this ideology. So do your research. Don't trust the reputation. Trust the parents that are involved in those schools. And the last thing I would say is the number of people that I know who are considering homeschooling right now, it's not like the Duggars. It's not people in prairie dresses. It's people on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. And I'm just saying, if you have the means to send your child to a private school in New York City, you certainly have the means to think about really creative solutions, I know someone that hired a PhD, out of work PhD from Stanford to tutor their child, like, 19th century style. Like, there's a lot of alternatives. And I would just emphasize that I don't think there's any more precious resource and more precious thing than, like, I don't want to sound cheesy, but our souls. And I really, really feel that way. And I don't think anything is worth that price. I just really don't. As for the Jewish part, and I get this question a lot because parents are really concerned about their kids being in environments that are hostile to them, or where they feel they have to kind of hide or play down who they are, or their true beliefs. And I would simply say that sending your child into an environment when they don't have the right tools, where they've, maybe gone to Hebrew school once a week that wasn't so great, they don't really do Shabbat, and now all of a sudden they're in an environment where they're being told that being Jewish is privileged, it's bad, it's something to be embarrassed about, and Zionism's even worse. The child that will shrink away in the face of that, and ultimately, I would say, be lost to the Jewish people, is the child that doesn't have a deep, profound sense of Jewish pride and their Jewish identity. There is a very, very clear pattern in every child that I speak to. I'm talking now about middle school, high school, and college, who is willing to take the risks and take the blows to speak out and be proud of who they are. And those are the ones who are proud of who they are. And they're proud of who they are, not because, they want to fight anti-Semitism, although that's good, but it's because they understand what they're fighting for. They have a very deep sense of themselves as having a place in the long chain of Jewish history. They're people for whom, someone like Hannah Senesh or Esther or King David or Sharansky or any of our heroes, Herzl, are not just figures in a history book, but are alive inside of them. And I'll make it personal. Like, that is 100% the driving force in my life. 100%. I would not be anything, and I would not be capable of an ounce of whatever little courage I've displayed in my life, were it not for that deep feeling inside of me that's in my cultural, historical, Jewish, whatever DNA that makes me feel like it's not just a feeling of debt to all of those people who made my life possible, but a sense of honor. And knowing that the choices that I make to leave the New York Times, not leave the New York Times, start a new thing, not like, you want to talk about privilege? Like, those choices are privilege. Those choices are privileged. And I'm aware of that and in gratitude for that every day of my life. And I think that, like, there's no shortcut. Like, that's the secret sauce. The secret sauce is raising proud Jews who have a deep sense of who they are, of what our people's about, of what Israel's about. And, like, when you have that, you have everything.
Bari Weiss, I was going to ask you a final question, but I wouldn't change a thing about your words. You have inspired us. You have challenged us. You've challenged me personally. And you've given us a roadmap. More importantly, the example of your life is an example that inspires knowingly and unknowingly. So we wish you strength. We hope that you have a continued return, please God, in person to Park Avenue Synagogue. We pray for the health of you and your loved ones. Mazel tov on the good news. And another time we'll talk about the real tragedy of our time, which was the utter collapse of the Pittsburgh Steelers this year. But that we'll save for another time. So to everyone who has joined us, just stay there because the video is going to play one more time. Hadley and Mara Bernstein and Lindsay Rubin and everyone on our programming team, thank you for making this happen. And our chairman, Mark Becker, and Olivia Becker for your leadership of our community. And thank you, everybody who has made yourself a stakeholder in our community on this Shabbat Shkalim. Bari Weiss, thank you from the bottom of all of our hearts for joining us this Shabbat. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.